Hello. The ethical issue that I chose to examine for this assignment was number five. That was the issue involving working with a 16-year-old female client who regularly and voluntarily engages in prostitution at the request of her 17-year-old boyfriend. She is adamant that he is not a sex trafficker and emphasizes that she is happy in engaging in this behavior. Now, right off the bat, I chose this one because it resonated with me the most out of all the examples. Um, that is probably because I have a close family member who, while the circumstances aren't exactly the same, has experienced a very similar situation herself. Unfortunately, that's kind of what drew me to this example in the first place, which kind of leads me into my first point of it immediately brought to my mind the chances of strong countertransference arising in session when dealing with this client. And just because I did have such a strong emotional reaction and connection to kind of the subject matter at hand and the plight of, what this client is going through. As I said, my initial emotional reaction was rather strong. I do feel great concern for this client in this situation, both for her physical and mental health and well being. Um, my own experiences and biases lead me to believe that honestly, it's very rare for anyone, but let alone a young female, to voluntarily and willingly participate in prostitution, unless under extreme duress or coercion. Um, I further question the capacity for a 16-year-old girl to make an informed decision in this area. Um, it just seems that at 16, you're so young. You're still a child. There's still so much growing up to do. It makes me reflect back to where I was at 16 years old, and although I was far from perfect, I just lived this just the sex trade was so far removed from my experience. It is, you know, almost it's challenging for me to put myself in those shoes. Um, but again, that's part of the work that we do, working with a diverse, group of clients from different backgrounds and different life experiences. It's something that is something that I'm very much going to have to deal with on a regular basis, and do look forward to those challenges. Um, Part of me believes that even though there's only a 1 year difference between the boyfriend and her, that just by the nature of the fact that he's an older male in her life, there is a power dynamic at hand there, and which may be leading into my suspicions around that she is kind of coerced, and how much of this is of her own choosing. Um, as far as what countertransference would look like, again, that's very important to recognize these feelings that very likely will arise in the session. Um, for me, that might mean in the tendency to want to, overshare inappropriately personal experiences with my family members, similar to this client's story. Furthermore, letting my these personal feelings that arise get in the way of the therapeutic relationship. Um, I would have to be very aware of my boundaries and making sure I don't overstep them, with my natural tendency wanting to be, you know, giving advice to this client, and definitely feeling a need to protect this client almost in like a fatherhood role, seeing as, I am almost 37 myself. I could be this person's father myself. Um, so yeah, that would be challenging to make sure that I have to step back from that, and you know remove my personal feelings from the situation. When thinking about this through the six, core ethical principles that we've referred to in class, one of the first ones that comes to mind is definitely autonomy. You want it's an essential tenet, and obviously I have to respect and want the client to, be making their own decisions and do what's best for them and respect their will. But at the same time, I feel like it can definitely comes into conflict with two of the other principles, such as which would be beneficence and non-malfeasance, meaning, our requirement to do what's best for the client and to avoid doing harm as well, um, which would be an ethical obligation of ours. In all honesty, that's where some of the gray area arises for me, where I get a little confused as to, yeah, it's our obligation to report if it involves, if the client, discloses that they are at a risk of causing harm to themselves or others. Mm, Again, that's where I get a little confused. Just, I feel I could make a pretty strong argument that just by the nature of engaging in prostitution, this client is putting themselves at harm, both could from STDs, potential sexually transmitted diseases, physical harm, let alone, the mental anguish, mental strain that engaging in such behavior can put on you, especially at such a young age when you're still developing. Um, so that's just an example of how the different core principles can come into conflict with each other, which, in my understanding, is kind of always going to be something that we battle with. From what I took away from class is that just be able to stand behind what your decision is and rationalize what steps made you come to that decision, and be able to support the decision you came to, um, obviously without causing harm to or overt harm to the patient. you know I'm always aware of how compassion fatigue could come into play in this role generally, but definitely, in circumstances like this where I do find myself very emotionally triggered, let's say, by the circumstances of that the client is presenting to me. It's something that you really got to be aware of the signs and symptoms that are that are compassion fatigue that might be leading to potential burnout. Um, Again, for me, that might be being very just one of the main steps is just being very aware of what those signs are, which I spoke to earlier about countertransference and just more or less the feeling of wanting to overstep those boundaries or the feeling that I need to protect or problem solve, you know, give advice in these situations. It's always a struggle of mine, but definitely, again, more so in these situations when I am as emotionally triggered. With that being said, I think one of the main ways to combat that is to be very aware of these signs. I'm a very introspective, self-aware person, very analytical, often over analyzing everything I say and do. So I don't see why that's not going to follow through into the professional therapeutic environment. Ways again to combat this would be to be open and honest about these feelings, um, bring them up to supervisors that I have available to me, and work through those feelings. Um, Furthermore, a big part would be, which I am doing and plan on continuing to do, is to engage in my own personal therapy around dealing with some of these issues and working through some of the unresolved, feelings that I have around, what this family member of mine went through and how that impacted them, and in turn how it impacted me. Um, Yeah, I think those would be the major ways to combat it. One is being aware, two is seeking supervision through the agency that I work with, and three would be to engage in my own therapy to work through these things. Again, it's not that we're not gonna have judgments in these situations. It's about not reacting on those judgments and being honest about what in our life, kind of what we bring to the table that led to us creating these judgments, and how to remain as objective as possible and keep the client's best interest in mind at all times. So, in summary, you know, there's going to be a lot of these situations where there's a little bit of a, I don't know, how should I say, ethical gray area, which, you know, there's nothing that this client is bringing to you that mandates through your legal, professional, or ethical obligation that bring this to anyone's attention or escalate this or address these situations. But, I might feel morally that this just really doesn't sit right with me. Again, just not acting on that in the situation and seeking supervision when I'm at all questioning which is the best way to approach these things, and standing, being able to reason um, how I've come to these decisions that I've made is, an essential part of backing up your decisions, and will be a very essential skill in the counseling field. Thank you.